I wanted to say good afternoon and thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the Mercer Island Parent Edge program of What I Said and What I Meant, Understanding Cross-Cultural Communications with Rosetta Lee. My name is Michelle Ritter and I am a member of Mercer Island Parent Edge team. And we are part of the Mercer Island PTA Council, and we're represented by all of the PTAs on the island and of the schools. Our goal is to facilitate conversations within and among families, schools, and the greater community, and we are so glad that you joined us today for this important conversation, given everything that's happening in our world and in our community. We're just very glad that you could all take some time out of your day to join us. We did want to let you know we are recording this webinar for those who aren't able to attend or for those who want to share with others after the presentation. And for some of you, you may remember we had scheduled Rosetta to come join us last spring, and then we had this wonderful snowstorm that the kids loved because we had snow days. However, we had to cancel the program, and then we tried rescheduling her, and then COVID hit. So we are so thrilled that she is actually able to join us now. And we're finding the silver linings, things like this that bring us all together. And actually, we found more people have been able to participate with the online format. So thank you once again for all being here. We would like to thank KCLS and Friends of the Mercer Island Library for their participation and partnering with us on this program today. And Parent Edge is made up of all parent volunteers. And so we'd like to take a moment to thank all of those folks who made today's program possible for all their dedication to keeping the dialogue going in our community and talking about these important topics. I would like to introduce two other individuals who will be assisting with today's program. Lori Cohen-Sanford is a Mercer Island Parent Edge member, and Carrie Bowman is a Mercer Island Library staff member, and they will both be helping with some question and answers. We do have some more programs coming up for Mercer Island Parent Edge as this evening. If you're able to join us for another program with Rosetta Lee, she will be exhausted by the end of the day, but she said she's got it in her. So at 7 o'clock tonight, we have Navigating Microaggressions. And Rosetta's going to share some strategies for what to do or say when you are the target of or witness to microaggressions. And microaggressions are those words or actions that offend or hurt, even though they may be unattended. So middle and high school students are also invited to join us for that program. So if you can handle one more hour of Zoom, we would appreciate you joining us. Some other programs that we have coming up. Every year we partner with Mercer Island Forefront team to bring youth suicide prevention for parents. We have two programs, one on November 19th and one on April 20th. And these obviously will both be done virtually. And so we'll be offering those to this year. Hopefully you can join us for one of those programs. This year, we are going to try something new now that we have the webinar format. We're going to try a virtual parent education series, and we'll have a variety of topics featuring local experts. And then we'll also have an opportunity for parents to connect with one another to talk about these topics. And we're going to do a quick poll because we'd like to find out from parents what are some of the top issues that are concerning you right now. So if you take a moment, we're going to launch a poll. And if you can check off the top 3 areas or issues that are of concern to you. And let's see, I was able to launch it here. Okay, so if you can take a minute. Does everyone see the poll? Did that work? Yes, okay.
Yes, responses are starting to come in.
Okay, good. I'm not seeing it on my end, so I just want to make sure it happened. And some of you may have filled this out if you attended our program with Devorah Heitner, but if you want to fill it out again, you can, or you can set this one out to whatever your preference is. And Rosetta, if you can let me know when it slows down, I can't see it on my end, and then we'll continue. I think we're all learning to roll with the technology. I was talking to a teacher today who said that she was teaching her 5th graders and somehow she got kicked out of the meeting. And so when she went to come back in, one of the kids knew how to let her in. And she said, luckily they let me in. And I said, that's pretty good. They could have gone rogue on you. But she said, no, they knew what to do. We didn't even miss a beat. We just kept going. So we just all learned to roll with it. Okay, give you just a few more seconds to finish up the poll.
Looks like the activity is pretty much ended, so I'm going to end the poll now.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I need it. Okay. And now on to today's program. We want to thank you once again for joining us. And we have Rosetta Lee with us. We're very excited to have her. Rosetta is a highly regarded local and national expert in diversity, inclusion, and equity. She's a faculty member at Seattle Girls School teaching science, math, technology, art, ethics, and social justice, which is impressive in itself. And for over 10 years, Rosetta has been a diversity speaker and trainer on a variety of topics, including cross-cultural communication, identity, gender, and sexual diversity, and has worked with over 175 K-12 public and independent schools throughout the country, as well as a number of colleges and universities. And we would like to give Rosetta a big welcome. And I'm going to turn it over to you. And Rosetta will share with us how we want to do the Q&A and other details. So thank you, Rosetta, for being here.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be here. Finally, we made the Mercer Island Parent Edge program happen after snow and pandemic. So I'm really happy to be here. I hope there are also some young people who are able to join as well. A few logistical things. Number one, in the chat, I have put in the link to today's slideshow. So you don't have to worry about remembering or writing down bullet points or taking screenshots. You'll have access to the full slideshow. So you are welcome to click on that and open it on another window. We will also do things like have chunks of learning and opportunities for breakout conversations so that you can process, just because it's a lot of information and oftentimes it becomes really important to place that information in the context of our lives. And then the chat, though I am unable to present and read the chat at the same time, I have folks from Mercer Island Parent Edge keeping an eye out for that. So feel free to use the chat as a conversation space among yourself, and as well as a question space. Feel free to jot down the question there. If it's a really salient and relevant sort of question for that moment, one of them will go ahead and interrupt me. And then otherwise, while you're in breakout rooms, I'll sort of catch up on the chat and the questions that came up and address it when you come back after the breakout group. If you want to do anonymous or you don't want to post the question publicly, let's see, I think it's Carrie who's doing no, Lori?
Yep, Lori.
Okay, Lori is doing the calling of anonymous questions. So if you want to private message her questions you don't want to publicly post, that's totally fine. If you private message me, I won't see it until the breakout space. Okay, so I think that's all the logistics that I wanted to get through. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing screen so we can get this party started. Okay, so you should be seeing a title slide at this point, and I'll actually put in the document. You don't need to go to that link. I'll put the document directly into the chat just before the first breakout. So the session is cross-cultural communication. I am from Seattle Girls School, all girls, all middle, all the time. So that explains a lot about me right there. I'm a classroom educator, and then I have the blessing of being able to work with communities throughout locally, regionally, and nationally around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's session will include chunks of information. The first one, which is cross-cultural communication. So the variance of communication that will appear across cultures and why sometimes misunderstanding and conflict can arise across cultures. And then a next chunk of information is cultural identifiers, power, and communication, because things like race and gender and class do affect the way we relate to one another. And it's not necessarily about us being from different cultural backgrounds or different nationalities or ethnicities. And then always throughout, we will be asking ourselves, so what now? With this information, how do we improve our interactions across all forms of difference? And when I think about culture, I just want to name the fact that I am not talking about just things like race or ethnicity. I find that culture is informed by many, many layers of identity. We have internal identities like race, class, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, ability, age, and gender. These are internal identities because we are that, we are born as that, or we are raised as that. So even though I don't practice Buddhism anymore, a lot of my core values align with Buddhist teachings because that's the way I was raised. There are also internal identities because there are whole systems in society in place so that we experience the world depending on what groups we belong to in fundamentally different ways. So there are aspects of ourselves that experience privileging. So, for example, I'm an able bodied person. So, with that privilege, when I was growing up, there were plenty of picture books and storybooks that reflected that identity, culture, and experience. Most of my teachers were able bodied, and the curriculum said able bodied people make history, they write great literature, invent science and technology. And I could turn on TV or go to the movies, and I could see ample representation of people who are able bodied, taking up the full range of human experience. And I could look into any field, industry, government, entertainment, athletics, medicine, and I would find plenty of able bodied people and often in leadership positions. So when it comes to being a member of this group, the message was if you're smart enough, if you're talented enough, if you work hard enough, you can basically become anything you want. And that was societally, culturally, and structurally reinforced message. Now, some of our identities experience marginalizing. And marginalizing, I find, comes in two forms. One, which is invisibility. It is hard to find the storybooks and the teachers and the curricula and the media representation and the leadership role models that come from that background, identity, and experience. Not because they're not there, but because those aren't the stories that are centered in US mainstream society. And the other form of marginalization is this stereotyping. The messages out there seem to be pretty monolithic and two dimensional and often negative, so that it feels like along those identities, we feel like we have to overcome stereotypes to be seen as individuals. And often we are facing the results of stereotypes, which are often things like prejudice and discrimination and oppression. All of us have identities that experience privileging and marginalization. I've never met anyone who's like all privileged or all marginalized. And even when somebody's like, I've never experienced marginalization in my life, that's okay. Just wait. There's age, right? Age is one of those categories where we will experience mistreatment simply because of how old we are, right? Because when we're younger, we're told you're too young to understand, you're too young to have this responsibility, you're too young to know what real love is. There are laws in place so that you can't purchase certain things until we're certain ages, or engage in activities like voting or renting a car until we're certain ages. There are even jobs that have age minimums because, quote unquote, you're too young, right? And then if we're lucky enough to live old enough, we start getting told, you're too old. You're too old to learn this new technology. You're too old to do this physical activity. You're too old to be still dating. Like, stop doing this by this age, give that up by this age, and retire by this age because you're too old. I have a secret theory that for like 30 minutes when you're 34, you're going to be just the right age. So if you're not there yet, I hope you pay attention. I missed my window and I'm super sad about that, right? So what this means is we're actually wired for deep empathy across difference because we all know what it feels like to be normalized by the world, and we all know what it feels like to be othered by the world. Now, culture is also informed, and our experience in the world is also informed by external factors. You can have two people who have the same intersection of internal identities, and yet geographic location will affect that experience. So, a multiracial person in Seattle, Washington will have a different daily experience than a multiracial person in rural Mississippi, because the rates of multiracial folks and the attitude toward multiracial unions are very different in those places. Or if you grew up working class in a working class neighborhood, I bet you heard positive and affirming things about working classness. Whereas if you grew up working class in a wealthy neighborhood, you might have not heard those messages. And depending on how you identify, if you are a person of color, LGBT, immigrant, Muslim, etc., depending on where you're living in the country or the world, the daily experience can be normalized or completely othered. So geography matters. Appearance matters. There are many aspects of my identity that come through in appearance with, and I don't even have to say much about it. You're perceiving things about my race, perceiving things about possibly my gender, possibly my age, possibly my ability status. All those will actually shape impressions about who I am, and it'll affect the way people treat me, right? And there are also other visual markers of things like ethnicity through things like kente cloths and burqas, markers of religion or spirituality through things like visible symbols that we wear, or yarmulkes, or Sikh turbans, or hijabs. There are also markers of socioeconomics, because somebody who is dressed in a three-piece suit gets perceived and treated differently in this world than somebody in sweatsuits, right? Does your jewelry look real? Do you engage in brand name labels that are associated with high cost? What's your communication of gender through things like hair, clothing, makeup, jewelry, etc.? Right? And then when you open your mouth, what happens? We all have language. Primary language, we all have accents, and all of those things actually come with impressions about normalization or othering. Not only that, there's actually subtle things in our vocabulary that communicate who we are. So if you call the same symbol a hashtag or a pound sign, I generally know how old you are, right? If you call the same bubbly drink a soda, pop, or a Coke, I know whereabouts in the country you were raised, right? If you call it a bagel and cream cheese and smoked salmon, or you call it a bagel, schmear, and lox, that tells me a little bit about you too, right? And folks will even assume things about your intelligence or socioeconomic background or educational attainment based on speech patterns as well. Because I'm actually perfectly capable of speaking fluently like this. Well, I says this and then he says this back to me. And I says to him, I don't need nothing from nobody. But I know that if I do that, I will get perceived and treated differently in this world than if I choose to speak fluently this way. Might you please pass the butter this way? Okay, so language matters. And in US mainstream culture, educational attainment matters. I'm not convinced that the United States values smart people so much as formally educated people, because I've known brilliant folks with little to no formal education, but they are perceived and treated differently in this world than somebody who's actually making foolish decisions, but they happen to have a string of letters behind their name, particularly from certain institutions. And of course, we have institutional identities as well. There are expectations around how a minister is supposed to show up, or how a school principal is supposed to show up, right? So there are these we have these internal, external, and institutional identities. And all of those things shape how we show up in the world in any given context. Given all of this diversity, considering that no two people are actually exactly the same, it's actually miraculous that we communicate effectively at all. And so I just wanted to note that the way you show up in your communication may be informed by actually multiple layers of who you are and where you're from. Now, what I'm hoping to do is raise everyone's cultural self-awareness a little bit, give you a little bit of understanding around what your communication styles are and why you show up the way you do. Learn a little bit of cultural intelligence. Why do other folks show up the way they do? And how is that equally valid but fundamentally different? And then develop some cross-cultural effectiveness skills where, knowing some of those differences, hopefully we can increase our skills in communicating more effectively, collaborating more powerfully, and being in healthy conflict across difference. And hopefully we can also counter oppression through inclusion, where we try to manage those dynamics of privilege, bias, and isms that affect communities in fundamental ways in all of our institutions. Okay. The field of cross-cultural communication, it's not something I studied in school. It's something I studied because I was trying to understand what was happening in my own life. I was born and raised in Seoul, South Korea until I was about 10 years old. And then my family moved to suburban Massachusetts to a predominantly white neighborhood. I had never been to the United States before. I'd never taken an English class. So as you can imagine, I had to do a lot of communication learning, from the basic language to idioms to nonverbal norms, you name it, right? And then, as you can hear, I picked up the language okay, right? I did well in school. I got into a good college. I got good jobs. So I figured, like, 15 years of living and working in New England, I'm like, American communication, check, I'm done, right? Now I'm going to go learn Cadasta, right? And then I moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, and I went from being one of the nicest people in Providence, Rhode Island, to being one of the rudest people in Seattle, Washington. And I'm like, what just happened, right? So this is how I got involved in the studies. And there are lots of theories that help us understand that we show up fundamentally differently when it comes to communication. I don't necessarily want to go into the theory backgrounds fully, but just know that there are domains of how researchers have studied cross-cultural communication and developed these dimensions of variability. I don't want you to think about these in terms of binaries, one or the other, but actually two extremes of a spectrum, okay? And in each of these spectra, are actually independent of one another. But I want you to start thinking about why these differences can show up in communities and how they can result in things like misunderstanding or conflict. So, individualistic cultures, for example, they really value the uniqueness of individuals. Like standing out from the crowd is considered a good thing in these communities. Oftentimes, individualistic cultures will have competitions that have first and second and third place. These are cultures that celebrate things like superheroes and mavericks and iconoclasts. And if there's a lot of I language, right? And if there's a direct conflict between what a group needs and what an individual needs, it's expected that the individual needs will be met. Now, in a highly collectivistic culture, it's the opposite. Standing out from the crowd or trying to be different than everybody is considered showing off or being like unhelpful, right? There's a lot of we language. If you celebrate accomplishments, it better be of the group, right? If there's a direct conflict between what a group needs and what an individual needs, it's expected that the group's needs will win. So, in an individualistic culture, I'm encouraged to be the best and most unique Rosetta I can be. In a collectivistic culture, I'm encouraged to be the best teacher I can be, the best citizen I can be, the best daughter I can be. It's always in the context of a collective. Now, low context communicators, the super low context communicators, they really care about the words and not much else, right? They're like, I understand what you said or what you wrote, and therefore I get the message. Whereas highly contextual communicators are like, your words may have said this, but your face said this, and your body language said this, and your voice tone is saying this. And we were in a fight last week. So, how is that informing what's going on right now? Everything matters, right? And to give you an example, I was a part of a cohort based program called Leadership Tomorrow. And it had been a number of years since I went through the program. I miss a lot of my friends in that cohort. So I decided to host a dinner party at my house. Now, I don't like Seattle RSVP culture where people are like, maybe. And I'm like, I need to know how much to cook, folks, right? And so I was doing the obnoxious East Coaster thing where I was just calling people and saying, I'm hosting a dinner on this day. Can you make it? Yes or no, right? Freaking people out. But I'm getting yeses and nos. And about midway through my list, somebody's like, I really want to come. I really miss this group. Unfortunately, I had a thing at 8:30, so I won't be able to show up. But gosh, the next time you have something like this, will you let me know? And I said, well, let me ask you this. If we ate at dinner early enough, do you think you can hang out and just break bread and hang out at least for the meal? And she's like, you don't mind if I leave early? I'm like, not at all, not at all. If we ate at 7, would that give you enough time? She's like, yeah, absolutely. I'm like, you got it. We'll have dinner at 7. Come on by, right? So I start calling people back on who had already said yes, right? And I'm like, by the way, we're going to have dinner right at 7, and it's going to be really important that we start on time. So please try to make it on time. Okay. Some folks were like, you got it, dinner at 7. Some folks were like, are you saying I'm late all the time? Because it mattered that I called back. It mattered how stressful I was with the start time and that we needed to start on time. That all had meaning. I'm like, I just want to eat at 7, right? But ultimately, like, that's an example of communication difference that like sort of caused misunderstanding. The super high task oriented communicators believe the primary purpose of communication is to get something done. The relationship oriented communicators believe the primary purpose of communication is to build relationships. And this is where I get into trouble a lot because I'm actually super task oriented. So I'm well known at my school to like come in after a weekend and basically accost my colleagues and go, I read this fantastic article about what this other school did. It's right up our alley. We haven't decided what we're going to do on Thursday. We should totally do this. What do you think? And my colleagues are like, how are you, Rosetta? How was your weekend? And I'm like, I'm a nice person, I really am, but I forget to do anything relational before I like dive into business, right? The low uncertainty tolerating folks and cultures, they don't like ambiguity. So these cultures will try to find assurance. Like, these are the folks who will say things like, wait, can you say that again? Can you paraphrase that? Maybe say it a little differently. Wait, is this what you're talking about? Right? They're just getting assurance because they don't tolerate uncertainty. They have low uncertainty tolerance. High uncertainty tolerating folks are like, I'm not sure what you're getting at right now, but that's cool. Like, we'll just keep on interacting and eventually the true meaning will become clear, right? I love looking at cultural idioms because I think they tell us a lot about cultures. There's this beautiful Chinese idiom that says, do not draw legs on a snake. Do not draw legs on a snake. And many of you are like, oh, that sounds really deep. I have no idea what it means, but it sounds super deep, right? Here's the US mainstream equivalent. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay. Uh, so examples of low uncertainty, high uncertainty. Um, Vertical and horizontal cultures. Vertical cultures believe that there is a hierarchy in society that should be respected. Some people do deserve more deference, more respect, better treatment. Maybe it's because they are older. Maybe it's because they have a certain role in the family or in the organization. Maybe they accomplish something really important. Whatever it is, the value orientation is give credit where credit is due. So it is expected that certain people will receive more elevated treatment. Whereas horizontal cultures are like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, how old you are, what you do. Everybody should be treated the same. And the value orientation is equality. What I find interesting about US mainstream culture is that it talks a really horizontal game, but it often shows up vertically. Like I've had folks argue with me, I treat everybody the same, but when I watch them interact with folks who pump gas or work at fast food counters, it looks fundamentally differently than how they interact with like doctors and lawyers, right? So I'm not sure what US mainstream culture is about. Um, Direct communicators and indirect communicators. Direct communicators tend to be efficient in their words, trying to get to the point and as quickly and directly as possible. And in conflict, particularly, this is a difference that shows up. Direct communicators tend to go to the source of the conflict and try to deal with the conflict head on. Whereas indirect communicators, especially if the message is hard to hear or negative, they will actually talk around the issue and hint at it, right? And in conflict, we'll often do things like talk to other people involved or try to address the situation in vague and general terms instead of dealing with the person most directly involved in that conflict. Formal and informal communicators. Formal communicators tend to believe that you don't disclose certain levels of personal information or you know, become informal with somebody until you've like reached a certain level of relationship, right? Whereas informal communicators tend to sort of let it all hang out from day one, right? And so if you've ever encountered like a colleague who you're like, I've been working with you for like 5 years and I just found out that you had kids, you might be talking to somebody who's a formal communicator, right? Or you just met a stranger and you're like, I just met you and I should not know this much about your divorce. You might be talking to an informal communicator, right? Expressive and restrained communicators. Expressive communicators tend to do things like vary tone, facial expressions, body language to create emotional expression along with the verbal message. Whereas restrained communicators tend to be more like neutral in the face, more monotone, less expressive in body. For me, like this, whenever I look at this domain, I'm just reminded of the first fight I had with my now husband when we were first dating. The first time we got into our first real argument, where I don't even remember what we were arguing about, but I was just like gesticulating and yelling and totally emotional. And he's like dead face. And I'm like, you don't care. You don't care. Let me look at you. You're not changing your face. There's no emotion. You just don't care. And he turns to me and he goes, actually, everything coming out of your mouth is enraging me. I'm like, oh, I think I might be dealing with somebody who's a restrained communicator. Right? So I know what's happening right now, which is as I'm describing these dimensions of variability, you're starting to map yourself, aren't you? You're like, I'm somewhere in the middle on this one, and I'm pretty far on this one, and things like that. You're also sort of like rethinking some of your relationships. Maybe they're not anal retentive, they're just low uncertainty tolerating, right? So I actually invite you, I'm going to send you into breakout groups, and I invite you to have a chat. Now, If there were zero consequences for how you communicate, what would be your most authentic and preferred style? The reason why I say that is a lot of folks are like, well, it depends on the context, right? And I know we can like shift, and I know we can flex. How I show up when I'm teaching my fifth graders looks different than how I show up with my partner or my friends, or how I show up. I used to be a freelance carpenter, how I would show up to a work call. Like, I know I can shift, but I do have some like preferred ways of being that I happen to adjust in those different settings. So I invite you to think about what would be your most authentic and preferred style. And the second question I invite you to consider is, what are the dimensions where that are the sources of greatest conflict or misunderstanding? So for example, because I'm so task oriented, I'm often perceived as rude or abrupt or impersonal by highly relational folks, and I tend to misinterpret and judge them too, right? So those are the two questions. And again, I know that I'm going to stop sharing right now. I know many of you joined partway through, so you may not have seen the link. This is the link that I just put into the chat for the slideshow in case you want to refer to that dimensions of variability slide. And then I'm going to create a breakout groups, and let's see. Let's do, how about 5 or 6 people per group? Yeah. Okay. And then let's see, it's 5:03. So let's do 10 minutes for this initial conversation. And I invite you to have a chat with one another and then come on back with lots of questions and comments. Enjoy. I'm just going to wait for all of the groups to come back before I begin again. I hope you had some great chats. Feel free, if you have any comments or reactions or questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And if you want to be called on, please write your name and then say call on me. That way the co-host can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. All right, so all the rooms are closed at this point. I know 10 minutes is not enough to unpack all of the nuances of our individual communication and some of the points of conflict, but I hope it was helpful to have some shared language as you talk about some of these differences and misunderstandings that are inevitable. And this is at this point, if you would like to populate the chat with thoughts, reactions, or questions, and if you want to be called on so you can ask your question directly, if you can either raise your hand, or I don't know if raising hand is functionality is on, but you can either raise your hand or just say your name and then be asked to be called on. That'd be great.
So Rosetta, I cannot seem to go into the participants and unmute.
Oh, okay.
For some reason. If I can't, oh wait, here we go. Yes, I have someone raising their hand. Carrie Chen, shall I unmute her?
Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, Carrie. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So Rosetta, what's your view on, like, I wouldn't say situational leadership, but like situational communication? Because, you know, we discussed in our little breakout group that it really, sometimes we have our innate tendency and a certain communication style, but when we wear different hats, we're going to pick different ways, right? Like I just from my own experience, you know, I gave an example of being a fundraiser and like a project lead, and it's completely different behavior. I mean, it's the same person, right? So what's your view on that?
Yeah, I like to think about the difference between like cosmopolitanism and code switching. And here's what I mean by that. Cosmopolitanism is like when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? It's your ability to be adaptive and pick up on cultural norms and cues. It's what allows you to be a wonderful international traveler, a fabulous house guest. You are able to like enter new workspaces and hit the ground running. And it is a skill set, right? And so you knowing that certain ways of being are more effective in a given setting and adapting to that is a skill set that you apply by choice. For me, there's a difference between that and like code switching, which is my authentic way of being is actually seen as less than, so I have to shift in order to be seen as professional, polite, acceptable, or even basically safe, right? So for me, like learning that many Islamic cultures consider the left hand unclean, and meeting somebody from one of those cultures and being mindful of not passing food with my left hand is a burden, a psychological burden, but it's a enjoyable burden because it makes me feel more cosmopolitan and more polite and more accepting. Whereas if I'm a woman and I'm dating a woman and I'm in a homophobic institution, I'm playing the pronoun game hard, right? My partner and I this weekend went there, and yes, my spouse is a fabulous person and all that kind of stuff. And I'm so worried about slipping because if I mess up, then I could get fired, right? I even think about like communication differences. One of the things that I notice is that, this idea of like talking up your accomplishments. Like I sometimes worry about workplace cultures that only value like self promotion, because for some, like that is not their natural way of being. In fact, they're never going to do that. And so a lot of workplaces miss out on tremendous workers and leaders and potential high potential folks that they never hear about because the self-promoting channel is just not utilized by those folks. So I often think about like widening those apertures for how we interact with one another. So for me, like as a classroom teacher, I'm pretty like high uncertainty tolerating. I never liked it when teachers are like, you're going to learn this and you're going to learn it in this way and you're going to demonstrate your knowledge through this project. Like I didn't like those restrictions. So as a teacher, I tend to be pretty expansive. I'm like, the Human Body Systems Project. Tell me that you know all the organs of that body system and how they work together to perform that overall function. Whether you want to show me through a poster, through a presentation, through an iMovie, through an interpretive dance, I don't care, right? And for some students, that is fabulous. They're like, oh, that is great. And they're like, I can't read, like, I can't, wait to get going. Some students are like, wait, how many items do you want on that poster? How big a poster do you want? How much text and how much imagery? And I used to not understand where they were coming from. Like, listen, I'm giving you a lot of freedom, just use it. But I realized they're low on certainty tolerating. They need to know what the hard boundaries are. And once I define those, they're going to play real hard inside those boundaries. But if I never define them, they're just going to be anxious through the whole project. So for me, it's about like knowing those variations, and especially as leaders and educators, like being willing to expand to the needs, because what I care about is seeing the students' full excellence, not that they need to demonstrate it in the way that I like to see it. Yeah.
I have a question, Rosetta.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips for helping people become more aware of these different dimensions? I guess just sort of like exercises to really challenge ourselves to be more perceptive as to pick up on some of these differences in cross-cultural communication?
Yeah, and I often think about this idea of this comes up later on in the presentation, but I'll just go ahead and say it now. Oftentimes we go to the mental model punchline right away. Oh, that person is so rude, or that person is really impersonal. Like we make these like judgment calls, right? And I'm often like, I need to go back down the ladder of inference, because we have a tendency to move really quickly up this ladder where there's like observable data, right? Everything we see and hear and experience. And then we pick out selective data, right? And then we draw conclusions based on that selective data, and we create whole belief systems out of it. So this idea of that person is rude and abrupt is a belief system that I need to trace back to. Why do I think that? Oh, because I was in the middle of saying something and they jumped in. But honestly, there are so many cultures for whom the speech and interchange pattern is overlapping. I just happen to grow up in a culture where if you want to demonstrate respect, you let that person finish, you wait a couple of beats to make sure that they're finished, and then you say your piece. I can't look at that person through my cultural lens. I have to sort of, and in fact, there have been times when I sort of like just go ahead and like name that dynamic for me, right? I'm like, because I had a colleague who constantly did that. I'm like, I gotta tell you, this is the way I was raised, so I'm really having a hard time, and I just like I think I was carrying a lot of baggage and judgment, because not only was I raised in a culture that said listen to people fully, I also had previous work experiences where colleagues who interrupted me like undermined me or discredited me or things like that. So I have a lot of baggage around interruption. So I just had to name, like, this is some of my history and this is some of my cultural background. So I worry that you don't respect me, or that you don't value what I have to say, or that I'm not going to get credit for the work that I do. And so I don't want to make those assumptions. I find myself like holding back my best ideas, or assuming that you're like, trying to like cut me off. And I don't want to make those assumptions. I would really appreciate it if you could, to let me finish what I'm saying. Like, it would make a huge difference for me, right? And I was sweating the entire time that I had this conversation. And it wasn't like after I said it, like she never did it again. But the next time she did it, she's like, I did it again, didn't I? I'm so sorry. Please finish what I'm saying, so that I can understand that that is not an intentional thing that she's doing. I also released that chip on my shoulder, and I really watched her interact with other people. And she does this to everybody, not just me, right? And then I met her mom, and everything became clear, right? Like, she comes from a family of people who overlap speech. Like, she may have never heard a full sentence in her entire life. So I have to be also more understanding and patient about her cultural way of being as well, right? But for me, I often find that we go to that mental model jump, but we never actually check our assumptions and interpretations. And sometimes I actually like to folks find it awkward at first, but really helpful once we start applying it. Like, when I'm in a new work team or a new community or whatever, I'll actually like go through the dimensions of variability and just like ask us to like start thinking about and naming it, so that like for me, like it's that idea of we're trying to like figure each other out, like from as blank slates. But I think when we have shared language, you can actually name some of the ways we show up in the world, and some of the ways that interpretation happens.
Rosetta, I have a question. When you're working with youth, do you encourage youth to try on these different variables, or what if a young person is really totally convinced that they have this particular variable? Should it be encouraged? Should they be encouraged to try other variables? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I for me, it's not so much like I think it's important just to know where you are right now. And I always tell the kids, like, how I would map myself in my 20s is different than how I would map myself in my 30s and my 40s, right? So we do shift, right? And the other thing I think about is, even if you have a strong way of being, how are you increasing your skill sets across difference? Because as much as I would like to be relational, I often have to like backtrack. Like, I will write email messages that are like, hey, so and so, I need this by 7. Bye. Right. And then I have to go back and go, dear so and so, I hope you're having a great day so far. It'd be really great to have this by 7. Let me know if you have any problems. Have a nice day, Rosetta, right? And I don't think of myself as faking it. I just do that for the people who are relational. There are also folks who are task oriented who love my emails. They're like, within 3 lines, I know exactly what to do, and it's efficient, and I don't have to like dig through and find the real message. So it's not about good or bad. It's just different. I just need to figure out how to be more effective across difference. So with young people, I'm like, there's no good and bad about this. Just know like where you stand, and also think about, especially in those areas where you have a strong preference, what skills are you building so that you can be effective with folks on the other end of the spectrum? Because the inevitable thing is you're going to encounter conflict, and conflict doesn't have to be a terrible thing, but it does need to be like negotiated well. Awesome. Oh, time flies. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into the next section, just because I do want to be realistic that my being super task oriented, oops, sorry. My showing up super task oriented as a woman gets interpreted as unnurturing and uncaring, whereas a man shows up super task oriented and he's seen as business like and efficient, right? When a white person is emotionally expressive, they're often perceived as passionate and charismatic. When a person of color is emotionally expressive, they're seen as aggressive or angry or scary. So identity and power affect communication as well. So there are times when we have internalized oppression or dominance. So this is from Sherry Schmidt's Cycle of Systematic Oppression. She talks about how every group, there are stereotypes associated with that group. And then those stereotypes, those gross overgeneralizations or misinformation about groups of people can lead to prejudice, attitudes for or against groups that can lead to discrimination, where folks are treated differently, not because of what they've done or not done, but because of who they are. And then it becomes oppression when discriminatory practices become embedded into things like media or education or law enforcement, or and then it becomes internalized where communities start to believe that about themselves and that somehow this is the way it's supposed to be. So when I encounter high school age young women who tell me things like, I'm never gonna, like, I can't show how really smart I am in class because I'm never gonna get a date to the prom, right? When Black and Latinx young men tell me things like, I'm gonna get so many more opportunities and affirmation as an entertainer or an athlete, why should I pursue the sciences like you're encouraging me to? When I have students on financial aid tell me things like, I don't think I'm smart enough to be here. People keep on talking about countries they visited and museums that they've gone to and authors that they've met, and I have no idea what they're talking about. I'm just not smart enough to be here. I'm like, actually, those are all markers of access, not intelligence. But they're starting to internalize this notion of poor people are poor because they're dumb or not hardworking. I've also had men tell me there's a flip side, an internalized dominance as well, because I've had men tell me things like, less qualified women are getting my promotion. And I'm like, okay, one, why was that your promotion? And then two, tell me about the less qualifications. And sometimes there isn't actually hard data to back it up. It's just this impression that he would make the better leader, right? Or when, when like I presented at a racial equity conference and I was doing this workshop and an African American man was talking about how just before the workshop we had this amazing keynote and everybody was like so motivated by this speaker, and he was talking about how he was responding to the keynote in ways that are culturally real and comfortable and common for his community. So he was interacting with the keynote verbally and non-verbally. He was like, amen, yes, say it again, right? And then he was talking about a white person right next to him who kept on turning to him to go, shh, right? Because she felt like her way of engaging with the keynote, which was to be quiet and like receptive and not interactive, was the appropriate thing to do, right? Which I found really interesting at a racial equity conference, but that's another story. Um, but and so those are some of the dynamics that show up. Stereotype threat is when you belong to a group and there's a stereotype about your group and you're worried that you might be a stereotype fulfilling example. There's a part of you that's worried about that, even at a subconscious level, that you actually, it actually makes it worse. So for example, I've had women tell me things like, I don't want to be perceived as a hysterical woman. And when I get passionate about an issue, at the very times that I'm most worried about that are when the tears are uncontrollable. Or when people of color are like, I don't want to be perceived as the angry person of color. And they're like, and yet, like, there are times when I'm worried about that, that like the passion and the energy is even harder to control. I saw this firsthand in my own mother. She was the primary medical advocate for my dad, so she knows more about diabetes, kidney failure, and dialysis than most physicians do. But she has a very thick accent and she has limited English proficiency. And research has shown that people like doctors and nurses perceive accented or limited English proficiency patients as less medically knowledgeable and able to self-advocate. And what's interesting is I go to major appointments with her, not because I know any more than she does, but because she's like, when the doctors look at me like that, I forget the words. I forget the words. So I go there just to back her up and to remind her of things she already knows, right? And this also shows up in privileged communities as well, because it turns out like the folks who are part of a dominant group, but they so don't want to be perceived as like stereotyping or bias or things like that. That worry actually makes them show up worse. Like as an able-bodied person who I so care about being inclusive to people with disabilities. And I remember the first time I worked with a profoundly deaf man who eventually we became friends. But when we first started working together, within 2 weeks, he came up to me and said, "Why don't you like me?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about? I think you're great." He's like, "I'm a lip reader, so I've been watching you. And with everyone else, you like, yeah, you do your business, but you also like find out about people and their families and their hobbies and what they're studying in school and things like that. But with me, like, unless you need to tell me something or you need something from me, you don't talk to me. And right after you get what you need, like, you just disappear. Like, why don't you like me?" And I realized that my biggest concern in interacting with him was not doing the obnoxious hearing person thing where I just talk louder. Like somehow if I talk louder, a deaf person will all of a sudden will be able to hear. I've been watching that dynamic. Didn't want to do that. Or I didn't want to like over enunciate everything. And insult this guy who has been thriving as an amazing lip reader for most of his life, or like make big stupid gestures or use like smaller words and insult his intelligence. I didn't want to do any of those things. So in order to avoid doing those things, I was actually subtly avoiding him altogether, right? And it actually shows up in research around race as well. Claude Steele actually gathered a bunch of white participants and had them engage in a conversation cross-racially. And what was interesting is the white people who self-reported before the conversation, like really caring about like racial inclusion and wanting to never say or do things that would be biased or prejudiced or bigoted. The folks who are the most concerned about that in cross-racial conversations actually showed less warmth in the face and more awkward and like stuttering speech. And they even put more physical distance between themselves and people of color, which basically looks like a white person that doesn't want to interact with people of color, right? And so I'm often like, as a person of color, I don't know whether a white person shows up that way because they're racist or because they're not racist. Like it kind of looks the same to me, right? The good news about stereotype threat is that if you know about that phenomenon and you adopt a growth mindset, I know that it's hard and I know it's awkward and I know I'm worried, but with practice, with like repetition, with effort, I can get better at this. Folks with a strong growth mindset, it turns out, are much harder to affect with stereotype threat. And in fact, Claude Steele did an intervention where he primed the white participants with a little, pep talk. Like, we know that conversations about race can be uncomfortable for anybody, but we've asked everyone participating in this study to approach the conversation as a enjoyable cross-cultural interaction where you might learn something. And with that growth framing, white folks showed up a lot more comfortably and personably. Okay. Accumulated impact and microaggressions. Microaggressions is a term that was coined in the 1970s to distinguish the difference between like overt acts of bigotry, right? Like we're talking about like physical or emotional violence, like pressuring to like have discriminatory laws in place and things like that, to microaggressions as a counterpoint, because these are everyday things that happen that communicate less thanness or slights or hurts, okay? And sometimes it's unintended, sometimes it's intended, but often it's unintended. And a lot of folks get hung up on the term microaggressions. Like folks who are impacted, they're like, it doesn't feel micro to me. And then the folks who are doing it are like, I'm not being aggressive, I'm a good person. And I'm like, let's not get hung up on the language. That's why I like the old school term of accumulated impact, because we're not talking about the size of the event. We're actually talking about the accumulation of the impacts over time. And all of us know what accumulated impact feels like. Like if you've taken a road trip with really little kids, you know what accumulated impact feels like. Because the first few times they're like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? You're like, no, baby, we got 8 more hours to go, right? About the 60th time, they're like, are we there yet? Don't you want to chuck them out the window, right? And that is not because you're an awful adult. That is not because they're awful kids. It's because we have a hard time experiencing the same things over and over again. And so here's the thing. Intellectually, I know it's not like a big deal, right? I know folks are just trying to make small talk and express curiosity, but this is because I work with so many communities a year and I meet easily 20,000 people a year. This is a conversation that I have often. Folks are like, "So Rosetta, where are you from?" I'm like, "Well, I'm from Seattle, Washington." And they're like, "No, like, where are you originally from?" I'm like, "I was raised in Boston." And they're like, "No, like originally, where are you really from?" And I'm like, "I was born in South Korea." And they go, "Ah, that makes a lot of sense." Except it doesn't, right? There's nothing in my accent, my language, my mannerisms, my dress, my way of being that says I just got here, right? But this is a question that I get 4 to 10 times a month, right? And there are days when I'm feeling patient and expansive and I'm feeling educational. And so they're like, "No, originally, where are you really from?" And I just have to say, I think the question you're trying to ask is, what's your ethnic heritage? Because that's Korean, but I'm actually a US citizen from Seattle, right? That's on a good day. That's on a good day. I'm not going to pretend that I'm like that all the time, because there are days when I'm tired, right? There are days when it's already happened too many times. Like I went to a meet and greet event where literally 7 conversations in a row went, "Where are you from? Where are you really from? Oh, Korea. I love kimchi." And they moved on, right? So the 8th person that comes up, I'm kind of done with this conversation. So they're like, "No, originally, where are you really from?" And I'm like, "I'm originally from my mother's womb. And you?" Right? And that is not because I'm angry or hypersensitive. It's just because I'm really tired of this conversation, right? So, this is what happens when African Americans are told you are so articulate, or hair is touched without permission, or when multiracial folks are asked, "What are you?" Right? When women and girls are told you play football and use power tools. Older folks are complimented because you know how to use an Apple Watch and an iPad. Good for you, right? This is where lesbians are told you're too pretty to be lesbian. Or adoptive parents are asked, like, "Have your kids met their real parents yet?" Like, if you listen to the intentions, there's actually nothing hostile about any of these. And yet, when they happen to the same community over and over again, a different subtextual message gets across. Because when it's me and people who look like me who are the ones asked, "Where are you from?" and folks are waiting for another country, I start to hear, "Where are you really from?" Because people like you aren't actually Americans, right? African Americans here, you're so articulate and I didn't expect you to be, or your body boundaries don't count, so I'm going to touch your hair just because I want to, right? Or when like multiracial folks basically hear, like, "I need to know what box to check for you, and I can't tell by just looking at you." Women and girls here, "You are the weaker sex, and yet look at you do these powerful things." Older folks here, "Isn't there like an age at which you can't learn new technology? How'd you manage?" Lesbians here, "Sexual orientation is a choice you make because you can't get a date with a member of the opposite sex. You're so pretty. What happened?" Right? Adoptive parents here, "You may love your kids. You may want to lay down your life for your kids when the moment comes, but you're not an actual real parent unless you got blood connections." Like, none of this is what we mean, and all of this is what gets heard. Okay. And so when folks have a strong when I say and do something and I get a strong reaction, I've stopped writing people off as like hypersensitive and overreactive. I've started to ask myself, like, what has happened here before? Right. And what is an unexamined stereotype of mine? And how can I learn more about that and do better? Because I don't want to contribute to this accumulation of impact. Right. Because I may be contributing a straw, but there are straws that break the camel's back. Right. And so we talked earlier about this idea of code switching, which is fundamentally changing what you do and how you do it for survival. Because if you don't do that, you will be perceived as less than, and there are some serious consequences. If I don't like code switch, I might not like get hired for that job, or I'll be passed over for a promotion. Or Claude Steele's book is called Whistling Vivaldi, and he's actually hearkening to an African American man walking down the street in a predominantly white area because of his skin, he is often perceived as a danger. So he's trying to short circuit that assumption by whistling classical music. The fact that he feels like he needs to do that just so he can stay safe walking down the street is something that we shouldn't have to do, right? In a just and fair society. Like fish seeing the water is, for me, the analogy I like to use for privilege, because honestly, whenever folks hear privilege, they're like, well, I work hard and like I don't have things easy. Like, why are you calling it like I'm not privileged? And I often think about like it's the privilege of fish like swimming in water. Like if it's a lake and you ask a fish, like, what's the water like? The fish has no idea, right? They're like, what water? But if you ask a land dwelling animal, what's the water like? They're like, oh yeah, water. It's wet. It's heavy on my chest. I can't breathe in it. So I go up to the surface to get gulps of oxygen. There's current, sometimes there's temperature. I can't walk in it. So these are the movements that I make to get around. Like they can describe it to a T, right? So my thing is like culture, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And sometimes it's really strong and it doesn't actually treat everybody the same. That's all, right? Because we have this tendency to turn what is statistically common, the norm, and we turn it into normal, which has a value judgment. It really means good. Okay. And we do this for everything. When a majority of the population is one way, whole systems are created to support that norm without always asking who's not in the norm and what do we have in place to help them feel normal. And to give you like a simple sort of example of this, like human populations, most of us are actually right-handed. There are a few of us who are left-handed, and very few of us who are truly ambidextrous. It's what genetic distribution studies have shown over and over again. So right-handedness is the norm, okay? And once upon a time, right-handedness was considered normal, meaning left-handed folks were considered somehow less than, they were considered defective, less intelligent, evil, children of the devil. Like the word sinister actually literally translates to left-handed. Okay, left-handed folks in back in the day, their left hand would be tied behind their back so that they would learn how to do things with their right hand. Left-handed children tried to write with their left hand, and then the teachers would slap their hand and then force them to write with their right hand, and then criticize for terrible penmanship. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. I can't believe we were so backwards. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Now we understand that handedness is just a part of human diversity and we live in a post-leftist world. Okay. Except we still have lecture halls where most of the desks are mounted for the convenience of right-handers. We still have computer stations where the monitor is here and the mouse is here for the convenience of right-handers. Complex keyboards, the number pad is on the right side for the convenience of right-handers. ATMs, monitor here, touchpad here. Ergonomic scissors should be really called ergonomically designed for the comfort of the right-hander scissors. Microwave ovens were designed with right-handers in mind. Honestly, a student can give me a mug at the end of the year to thank me for being a good teacher. And as a right-hander, I'm the world's greatest teacher and everyone knows it. But as a left-hander, I'm the world's greatest teacher, but only I know it. Right? And that is not because there's a conspiracy of right-handers trying to make life miserable. It's because the systems have been created to support the norm without always asking who's not in the norm and what's in place to help them feel normal. Like for me, like I ran into this full force several years ago. Like, my school talks a big game around religious inclusion. Like people of all faith traditions and non-traditions, you are welcome here, you belong. We say it a lot and we mean it and it makes us feel good. But it wasn't until like 5 or 6 years ago that I had a devoutly Muslim student who, because of family circumstances, got dropped off at the very beginning of morning care at 7 a.m. and got picked up at the very end of aftercare at 5:45 p.m. And she's like, I have daily multiple prayers. Is there a space where I can pray? And we had to go, we'll come up with something, right? And for all the talk that we had, I wish I could have said, yes, this is the space we had in mind and we've been waiting for you. Because I think that would have felt differently for her, right? So it's not about society upending what we do. It's always paying attention to, what things are in place so that folks who are not in the norm can always feel normal. Typically, when I get to this point of the slide, a lot of folks are like, wow, I don't want to interact with anyone ever again. Because clearly there is so many ways I can mess this up. And I invite you to think about this. I think the work of cultural competency is actually, always like doing the best we can to continuously learn. But in the meantime, go forward with the best of your intentions and the best of your learning and address the impact if you have unintended impact. Okay. Because what often happens is I've been working with people for like 20 something years, and people are basically good and they do have good intentions, but they do, because of like history and lack of education and things like that, say and do things that offend and hurt. And in those moments, when somebody says that hurt or that offended me or that's not okay, oftentimes like the response is, but I'm a good person, or I didn't intend that. And we got to get better at addressing the impact. Like, and I think we already know what to do, because we know what to do when we cause unintended physical harm. Like, imagine this. Imagine I'm driving down the street and I'm completely accidentally and unintentionally, I run over your foot. Okay. I'm going to jump out of the car and go, I am so sorry. You must be in so much pain. Can I get you to the hospital? I'm so sorry. Right. Because I'm a good person. I'm going to address the impact. Like, I wouldn't come out of the car and go, you know what? That was completely and totally unintentional. Like, I really don't think you should be hurt. Okay. Like, do you have to grab your foot and roll around like that? I think you're being a little sensitive. You're blowing things out of proportion. And it's like you're calling me a bad driver. Okay. And you don't know me. You don't know my driving history. I'm an excellent driver. And I have nothing against pedestrians. I love pedestrians. Some of my best friends are pedestrians. Like, I'm married to a pedestrian, right? Sounds a little silly, but I think I've heard a lot of conversations go this way. And folks have pushed me. They're like, you can't compare physical injury and psychological like offense. I'm like, I have to, because that's what the neuroscience says. Like, physical pain and psychological pain registers in the same areas of the brain and to the same degree. I've seen an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging, of somebody who has been overtly socially excluded and somebody who has been punched in the face, and it basically looks the same. So just like we know what to do when we cause unintended physical harm, I think we need to do better at addressing interpersonal harm. Like, over 20 years ago, I was walking down the street with a friend of mine, and there was this guy in a van that was parked on a hill. And so it was really tilted and the door was wide open. And I noticed that he was having such a hard time closing the door because he didn't have any arms below the elbows. Now, being a good person and a helpful person, of course, I approached to offer assistance, except I said, sir, can I give you a hand? Yeah, didn't think about that, just came out. All I know is he looks at me with all kinds of hate in his eyes and he's like, no. And I start walking away like, that was a weird interaction. And my friend is like, I can't believe you just said that. I'm like, what are you talking about? I just offered some assistance. I don't understand why you had to be so mad at me. And my friend is like, what words did you use? I'm like, well, I offered him a hand. And you bet I wanted to go back and say, I didn't mean that. I wanted to say, it's a phrase that I use for every situation where I want to offer assistance. I didn't pick it because you don't have arms. Like, that's offensive. I'm not that kind of person. I teach diversity workshops. So if anybody not meant it in the history of not meaning it, it was me. I wanted to. I couldn't. I had to go back and say, sir, I just realized what words I used to offer assistance. And it must have sounded like a terrible and offensive joke. I'm so sorry I said that. The guy actually knows that I didn't mean it when I'm willing to address the impact. And if I go back to say, you shouldn't take it so personally, or it's not that big a deal, or this is what I actually meant, it kind of sounds to him like, not only will I flippantly remind you of a lifetime's worth of comments, remarks, and jokes that hurt you, I'm going to go back to say, you don't get to feel the way you do because it's making me feel like a bad person. And that is not how I want to show up in the world. Okay. So again, our job is to continue to learn, but in the meantime, go forward with the best of our intentions and address the impact, whatever they may be. And I find that most of the time the impact is good, but every once in a while it's not. And in those moments, it's critical that we address the impact. Okay, so, not enough time. So here's what I would like to do. We're gonna do breakout rooms again. I'm gonna recreate them because I noticed that not everybody went into breakout groups, and I wanna make sure that you have enough conversation partners. Recreate, and then let's see, because we're running short on time, and I just like, I apologize, that slide contained like 20 years of research and I just talked at you for it. So I just want to give you an opportunity to like think about like what is new or thought-provoking, or sort of like, I guess for me, oftentimes there are many cross-cultural conflicts now I now understand them to be an identity and power difference conflict rather than a cultural conflict. So I invite you to have a chat about your ahas. All right. I'll bring you back in about 7. All right. I am sure this time for sure many of you were mid-sentence when you got booted out into the main room. I know that it's a lot of content to try to unpack, but again, this is not hopefully the end of the conversations, but beginnings of conversations using some shared vocabulary. Um, any questions or reactions or ahas you'd like to elevate to the larger group that before we wrap up?
I did have a private, I had a private question that does not have to do with this, so I don't want to ask it unless nobody else has a comment, and they can raise their hand and we can unmute, or they can put it in the chat. So does anybody have comments first? Okay. I had a private question from someone asking why there were not more guys on this call. And I wonder, Rosetta, if you have any insights into the audiences that you typically speak to, and if you see that as something that is common.
Yeah, one of the things I think about is like when there's like some of the dynamic of when you have parent groups, like statistically oftentimes like there are fewer men, and I think that's a lot due to a lot of historical sort of pressures around who's supposed to be the caretaker, right? Or even just who's supposed to like be involved with like the life of the school and who's not. And then once that like skewing happens, there's also the discomfort factor. There are a lot of caring dads that I know who's like, I want to be involved and I want to show up to things, but it's super awkward. I'm always like, am I going to be the only dude there? So sometimes there's all of that going on. And then so I don't necessarily think it's like a statement about men's like commitment to like diversity, equity, and inclusion, or their kids or anything like that. I think those are dynamics show up. Like I know that I love to build with my hands, and my dad was an electrical engineer and like a self-employed mechanic. I love working with my hands. And so there was a part of me that wanted to be able to do that for work, and I knew I was going to face a lot of being the only all the time and face a lot of assumptions. And there was a moment where I said it's just not worth it. So I invite us to think about what are the ways that we see men, fathers, uncles, caregivers as partners in raising awesome, inclusive children, and also deeply committed to creating community as well. And what are the ways that we sort of amplify that message so that it feels like it is a community where there is belonging? Because I'm guessing that all of the folks who identify as women in the room are like, we're so welcoming. That's not the point. It's just hard being the numerical minority, no matter what.
Thank you for that. That was, yeah, really great insight. And there were men on this call. I would like to say I saw at least 6 or 7 names and faces. And another person put in the chat, my husband's sitting behind me right now. He's just not on screen. So.
Awesome. Well, I so appreciate your time. I tried to embed a lot of the, takeaways, but again, it's that idea of when we're interacting across difference, there are cultural nuances that may show up. There may be dynamics of identity, power, privilege that show up. But again, I like on the slideshow, which I will put into the chat again, because I know that there was like some folks got dropped and things like that. And I also put into the chat a handout I usually like to give. And so feel free, if you click on the handout that's in the chat, it'll download it to your desktop. But one of the last slides is actually a quote from Dr. Okudon Udo, who was one of the first champions of cultural competency in the medical field. And he talks about to be culturally effective doesn't mean you're the expert in the values and beliefs of all cultures. What it means is that you hold a deep respect for cultural differences and you're eager to learn and willing to accept that there are many ways of viewing the world. It is a mindset and a practice, not a one-time event. So I hope this workshop was helpful in giving you some vocabulary and some framing around how we show up, and inspire you to be more curious across difference and interact in ways that we honor people's cultural and identity lens. So thank you so much. And if you're joining me in an hour, I'll see you in an hour so that we can interrupt microaggressions when they happen in our community.
And I did include the link for the 7 p.m. program if anyone is wanting to join and you don't have the link. So just check the chat. But thank you again, Rosetta. Take a break. And for those of you who can join us at 7, otherwise we will be recording that as well. And but we hope to see some familiar faces again. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.